This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we're talking today with Mallory Factor, the editor of the new book, Big Tent, the story of the conservative revolution, as told by the thinkers and doers who made it happen, featuring contributions from Michael Barone, Newt Gingrich, Ed Meese, Rand Paul, Donald Rumsfeld, and frequent PJTV contributor Yaron Brook, among many others. Sean Hannity writes the quote, "Big Tent is the definitive book on what it means to be a conservative," unquote. It's published by Broadside Books and available from Amazon.com in your local bookstore. And Mallory, thanks for stopping by today.
Wow, thanks for having me. That was quite an introduction. I'm thrilled.
Well, that's quite a collection of names you've assembled, and there are actually several that I've left out. Could you talk about how you rounded them up and the goal in assembling the essays and the personalities that are, if you'll pardon the pun, inside the Big Tent?
I'm a professor at the Citadel. It's the military college in South Carolina, which is a very conservative college to begin with. And my students had no idea what conservatism was. Some thought it was being religious. Others thought it was being a member of the Republican Party. And I can go on from there. So decided on putting together a course on what conservatism is, where it came from, how it came about, what are its pillars. And I found out that I knew very little about it. So I got a hold of the people that actually were there making the modern conservative movement. And I asked them to give a lecture at the school. We had 17 people in the book, and they all came from lectures given at the school, the Citadel. It's fabulous. We came up with a couple of interesting ideas. There are core principles to being a conservative. There are 4 core principles that go through all of the different wings of the conservative party. One is the respect for wisdom of past generations and traditions. 2 is the maintenance of the rule of law. 3 is the protection of individual rights and freedoms. And 4 is belief in a law higher than man's law. And you see that thread going through all the different types of and groups in the movement, from the paleocons to the neocons, from the evangelicals to the atheists, from the traditionalists to the libertarians, from the foreign policy hawks to the isolationists, from the Tea Partiers even to the establishment Republicans, just to name a few.
For those who think that conservatism started with William F. Buckley or Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan, could you talk about the origins of conservatism and how far the philosophy dates back?
Well, conservatism really starts in 4 cities, and those cities are ancient cities: Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, London, and it culminates in Philadelphia with the American experiment. Jerusalem gives us that true law is divine. There's a higher law than man's law. Athens gives us the concept of social order. Rome, a republic with separation of powers. And London, the concept of the universality of law, that meaning that law applied equally to everyone. And it culminates in the great experiment in Philadelphia, the American experiment. And that's really what conservatism is.
Mallory, let's flash forward to 20th century conservatism, which I tend to view as having 2 distinct eras: before William F. Buckley and National Review magazine, and after Buckley. Could you talk about how Buckley crafted a post-World War II Cold War vision of the philosophy?
He put together 3 groups. He put together a group that was fighting communism, which later became the neocons. He put together the social conservatives, and he put together the libertarians. And those became the 3 legs of the Buckley stool called fusionism. And in Big Tent, in the book, it goes into that in great detail and shows you how it actually comes together. But remember, in '64, the Buckleyites and the conservative movements got Goldwater the nomination, and he got creamed in the election, and everybody thought conservatism was dead. That once again they had talked about how it died. 16 years later, Ronald Reagan.
Barry Goldwater's defeat, though, gave rise to LBJ's disastrous Great Society. The post-Great Society era saw the rise of neoconservatives, who were viewed by many on the left as the good, sane conservatives, until they began influencing President Bush's foreign policy in the post-9/11 era. And then for a time, everybody who was conservative were called neoconservatives, largely by people who had no idea what the term meant. My favorite example was from around 2005, when Tina Brown, who would go on to edit until recently The Daily Beast, referenced the angry neoconservatives who opposed Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. For those like Tina who need a refresher on the history of neoconservatism, could you talk about how this element of conservatism was formed and its philosophical underpinnings?
Well, one of the most interesting and one of the most enlightening chapters in the book is a chapter by Doug Feith. I mean, it was eye-opening to me. He actually lays it out probably better than I will ever be able to do it, where he talks about how these were socialists who really got mugged by reality, and they became neocons to fight communism. And they were mostly Jewish, he says in the book, and that they later went on to become, to broaden out, become the national security hawks. And that's one of the core groups of today's conservative movement.
Following that chapter in The Big Tent, there's a chapter from Ralph Reed titled How Social Conservatism Can Win. How does social conservatism, neoconservatism, and libertarian conservatism coexist?
Not well. Not well at all. That is one of the key points you get from the book, particularly when you read some of the stuff that Haley Barber writes in it. The fact is that people in the conservative movement would rather burn heretics from other wings of the movement than actually unite and fight the infidels that are trying to tear down our country. That's the big problem of the conservative movement. It's a noble movement in many ways, but it falls short there. One of the things you learn from the book that I find just fascinating is that conservatism is an ideology. Republican and Democrat, that's a team sport today. Interestingly enough, 19% of Democrats self-identify as conservatives. 35% of independents self-identify as conservatives. And 30% of Republicans don't self-identify as conservatives because they don't believe they're conservative. So what you have is you have a very uneasy relationship between conservatives and between the Republican Party. But the conservatives use the Republican Party to elect conservatives. The Republican Party uses conservatives to elect Republicans. So they both need each other today unless there becomes a realignment, which I don't see coming. So it's a very uneasy relationship. One of the big problems that a lot of establishment, particularly Northeastern Republicans, find is evangelicals. They find that that's a big problem. But evangelicals today, social conservatives, constitute a whopping 27% of the electorate, with other types of religious conservatives contributing 10 to 12 additional percent. Republicans today, with the way the party's constructed, cannot win without the social conservative vote.
Mallory, you touched upon the left, and we'd be remiss without talking about them during this interview. Where do they go in the post-Obama era, and as it continues to be transformed endlessly like Play-Doh, arguably the post-Obamacare era as well?
Where does the left go?
Yes.
Well, I don't know what the left really is. I mean, if let's take an example of what the left is. Would you think that Berkeley's a pretty leftist campus in the United States?
Well, I did before they gave Rand Paul a
That's the point I was going to make, a standing ovation.
No, exactly.
But if you listen to that speech, which you can listen to online, and you listen to the speech he gave at CPAC, it's the same speech almost.
Mm-hmm.
That's telling you something. There is some realignment going on. And Obama is causing some of that realignment.
Mallory, before the interview began, we were talking about how the Big Tent was doing on the Amazon and the Barnes & Noble charts. How is it doing, and where are the proceeds from the book going?
It's doing terrific. We were in number 2 on Amazon. We were number 1 at the release on Barnes & Noble. And all of these lectures took place at the Citadel. They were part of a course I taught and still teach. And what we decided on doing, because of the Citadel's contribution to the book and its contribution to America, all the proceeds are going to the Citadel Foundation, which helps our young cadets.
Mallory, last question. Big Tent ends with a chapter from Rand Paul titled Towards a More Libertarian Conservatism, and an epilogue from Haley Barber, the former governor of Mississippi, and in the 1990s, the chairman of the Republican Party during the era of the 1994 contract with America. Those men offer 2 different visions of a conservative Republican Party. Going into November and heading towards 2016 and beyond, which vision of conservatism will ultimately prevail for the foreseeable future? Well,
the visions aren't as different as you may think. Both, I think, would agree with the Reagan 80-20 rule, and that's the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is a friend and ally, not a 20% traitor. So I think there's that. And the second point is, and I think if you talk to Senator Paul as well as to Governor Barber, Haley Barber, you would find that you have to do anything to bring freedom, prosperity, to bring these conservative ideals to America, you have to win the right to govern. And winning the right to govern is vital. And sometimes you have to compromise on policy, but you can't compromise on those 4 pillars I talked about earlier, or the Big Tent will fall down.
This is Ed Driscoll, and we've been speaking today with Mallory Factor, the editor of the new book, Big Tent, the story of the conservative revolution as told by the thinkers and doers who made it happen. It's published by Broadside Books and available from Amazon.com and your local bookstore. And Mallory, thank you for stopping by PJmedia.com today.
We love PJ Media, and thanks for having me.